Speaking of politics tonight, the buzz is growing that Beto O'Rourke will run for president in 2020. The Washington Post reported just today that O'Rourke met with former President Obama just days after he lost the U.S. Senate race to Ted Cruz. Former Obama aides have encouraged O'Rourke to run for president in 2020. O'Rourke says he's not ruling anything out yet. Meantime, former Vice President Joe Biden says he's the most qualified person in this country to be president. But Biden says he's still weighing whether or not he and his family are ready for a 2020 presidential race.